Imagine a kingdom so wealthy that its currency was the envy of Europe until one man convinced a king to print money out of thin air. What started as a brilliant economic experiment turned into a catastrophic nightmare that would shake the very foundations of the French monarchy. This is the story of John Law, King Louis XV, and the financial scheme that would leave a nation in ruins and plant the seeds of revolution. A tale of greed, illusion, and the dangerous belief that you can create wealth from nothing. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us, have you ever trusted something that seemed too good to be true? Let's get into it.
Paris, 1715. The Sun King, Louis XIV, had just died after a reign of 72 years, leaving behind a France that was magnificent on the surface, but rotting from within. The treasury was empty. Wars had drained the coffers. The national debt was crushing. And now a 5-year-old boy, Louis XV, sat on the throne, with his uncle, Philippe d'Orléans, acting as regent. Philippe was desperate. He needed money, and he needed it fast. Traditional solutions, raising taxes, cutting spending, were political suicide. The nobles wouldn't tolerate it. The people were already starving. He needed something revolutionary, something nobody had tried before. Enter John Law. Law was a Scottish economist, mathematician, and, most notoriously, a professional gambler. Years earlier, he had killed a man in a duel in London and fled to the continent, where he spent his time in gambling halls, refining his understanding of probability, risk, and human psychology. But Law wasn't just a gambler. He was a visionary. Or so he claimed. Law had a theory that seemed almost magical. Money didn't need to be backed by gold or silver. It could be backed by land, by future productivity, by the promise of wealth to come. Paper money, he argued, could stimulate the economy in ways that precious metals never could. It was flexible. It was modern. It was the future. Philippe d'Orléans, drowning in debt and desperate for solutions, listened. "Your Highness," Law said during their first meeting, his Scottish accent thick but his French fluent, "France doesn't have a money problem. It has an imagination problem. You're sitting on the wealthiest land in Europe, yet you act like a beggar because you think wealth must be made of metal. I can show you how to unlock the true potential of this nation." Philippe was intrigued. Law's confidence was magnetic. His ideas were radical but persuasive. And most importantly, he promised results, fast. In 1716, Law was granted permission to establish the Banque Générale, a private bank that would issue paper notes. These notes, Law insisted, would be backed by the bank's reserves and the productive capacity of France itself. At first, people were skeptical. Paper money? How could a piece of paper be worth anything? But Law was a master of psychology. He understood that money, at its core, is belief. If people believe something has value, it has value. So he began slowly, carefully, building trust. The bank's notes were initially convertible to coin on demand. Transactions were smooth. Merchants accepted them. Slowly, confidence grew. And then Law made his next move. In 1717, he approached Philippe with an even bolder proposal, the Mississippi Company. This venture would exploit France's vast colonial holdings in Louisiana, a territory so enormous and resource-rich that it stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. Law painted a picture of unimaginable wealth, gold mines, fertile plantations, endless opportunities. All they needed was investment. Philippe, desperate and dazzled, gave Law the monopoly on trade with Louisiana. Law launched a marketing campaign that would make modern advertisers jealous. He hired artists to paint exotic images of Louisiana, lush jungles, rivers flowing with gold, natives eager to trade. He spread rumors of mountains of precious metals just waiting to be discovered. He even paid actors to walk through Paris dressed as successful colonists, showing off their supposed wealth. The people of France went mad. Shares in the Mississippi Company became the hottest commodity in Europe. Everyone wanted in, from wealthy nobles to poor shopkeepers who scraped together their life savings. The stock price soared. Law became the richest, most powerful man in France, second only to the regent himself. In 1720, he was even appointed Controller General of Finances, essentially the kingdom's treasurer. John Law, the gambler, the fugitive, now controlled the entire French economy. People called it the Mississippi Bubble. Fortunes were made overnight. A new class of millionaires emerged. They were called millionaires, a term invented during this very period. Wealth seemed to appear from nowhere, and everyone believed it would last forever. But there was one problem. None of it was real. The bubble was about to burst, and when it did, it would take the entire kingdom down with it.
By mid-1719, the streets of Paris had transformed into a financial circus. The Rue Quincampoix, where Law's Bank and the Mississippi Company had their offices, became so crowded with speculators that the street had to be closed to carriages. People traded shares on street corners, in cafes, even in the gutters. A hunchback famously rented out his back as a writing desk for signing contracts and made a fortune doing it. The frenzy was intoxicating. Servants became richer than their masters. A duchess stood in line for hours just to buy more shares. Law himself couldn't walk through Paris without being mobbed by admirers begging for investment tips. He was treated like a god. But behind the celebrations, cracks were forming. The problem was simple. The wealth was imaginary. Louisiana wasn't producing gold. The colonies weren't generating profits. The whole system relied on one thing: belief. As long as people believed the shares were valuable, they were valuable. But belief is fragile. Law knew this. Privately, he was terrified. He had printed more paper money than the economy could support. The bank's notes were supposed to be backed by real assets, but there weren't enough assets to back them. He was juggling numbers, moving money from one account to another, creating the illusion of solvency while the foundation crumbled beneath him. In early 1720, a few sharp-eyed investors began to notice something strange. When they tried to convert their paper notes back into gold or silver, the bank hesitated. There were delays, excuses, temporary shortages, they were told. Prince de Conti, a nobleman who had become suspicious, decided to test the system. He arrived at the bank with 3 wagons and demanded his notes be converted into coin. Law, panicking, went directly to the regent. Philippe, protecting his golden goose, forced Conti to return the gold. But the damage was done. Whispers spread through Paris. What if the notes aren't worth anything? What if there's no gold? Law tried to maintain control. He issued decrees forcing people to accept paper money. He made it illegal to own large amounts of gold or silver. He even tried to artificially deflate the value of shares to make the system seem more stable, a move that only caused more panic. By May 1720, the bubble burst. People rushed to the bank, desperate to convert their paper into coin before it became worthless. The bank couldn't meet the demand. Riots erupted. 15 people were trampled to death outside Law's offices. Shops closed. The economy froze. Law's mansion was attacked by angry mobs. His carriage was pelted with stones. The man who had been worshipped as a financial genius was now hunted as a fraud. Philippe, desperate to save himself, turned on Law. The gambler who had risen so high was now falling fast. In December 1720, John Law fled France in disguise, carrying only a few personal belongings. The man who once controlled the wealth of an entire kingdom died penniless in Venice 9 years later. But the damage he left behind
was catastrophic. Thousands of families were ruined. Savings vanished overnight. The credibility of the French government collapsed. Trust in institutions, already fragile, was shattered. The royal treasury, which Law had promised to save, was now even worse shape than before. And perhaps most dangerously, a generation of French citizens had learned a bitter lesson. Their leaders were incompetent. The monarchy could be manipulated. The system was rigged. King Louis XV, still just a child, would inherit a kingdom built on ashes and resentment. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and they would take decades to grow, but they would.
Louis XV came of age in the shadow of catastrophe. By the time he took personal control of the government in 1723, at age 13, France was still reeling from the Mississippi disaster. The economy was stagnant, trust in authority was at an all-time low, and yet the young king seemed utterly indifferent to the lessons of the past. Louis XV was handsome, charming, and completely uninterested in governance. He preferred hunting, mistresses, and lavish parties to the tedious work of running a kingdom. His courtiers joked that he would rather chase a deer than chase solutions to France's problems. "After me, the flood," he supposedly said. "Après moi, le déluge," a phrase that would become his legacy. He didn't care what happened to France after he was gone. He lived for the moment, indulging every whim, spending recklessly while his people starved. But the financial rot that John Law had exposed never went away. It festered. France's debt continued to grow. The government relied on a patchwork of loans, taxes on the poor, and increasingly desperate measures to keep itself afloat. The nobility and clergy, who controlled most of the wealth, paid almost nothing in taxes. The burden fell entirely on peasants and the emerging middle class, the bourgeoisie, who were educated enough to recognize the injustice, but powerless to change it. Louis XV's ministers tried reform after reform, but each one failed. The king would approve a plan, then lose interest and abandon it. He cycled through advisors, none of whom could solve the fundamental problem. The system was broken, and those in power had no incentive to fix it. Meanwhile, new ideas were spreading. In salons and coffee houses across Paris, intellectuals gathered to discuss radical concepts: liberty, equality, the rights of man. Voltaire mocked the church. Rousseau questioned the legitimacy of kings. Diderot compiled an encyclopedia that challenged traditional authority. The Enlightenment was in full swing, and it was teaching people to question everything, including the divine right of monarchs. Louis XV ignored it all. He was too busy with Madame de Pompadour, his chief mistress, who essentially ran the government behind the scenes. She was intelligent and politically savvy, but even she couldn't overcome the king's fundamental laziness. In 1757, a man named Robert François Damiens tried to assassinate Louis XV, stabbing him with a small knife. The wound was superficial, but the symbolism was profound. For the first time, a commoner had dared to strike a king. The old order was crumbling. Damiens was executed in the most brutal manner imaginable, drawn and quartered in public. But the message was already out there. Kings could bleed. Kings could be challenged. Louis XV grew paranoid. He trusted no one. He spent his final years in increasing isolation, watching his kingdom slowly disintegrate while he did nothing to stop it. In 1774, Louis XV died of smallpox, a fitting end for a man whose reign had been a disease upon France. He left behind a kingdom drowning in debt, a population seething with resentment, and a grandson, Louis XVI, who would inherit an impossible situation. The new king was well-meaning,
but weak. He wanted to help his people, but he didn't know how. He appointed reformers, but the nobility blocked every change. He tried to raise taxes on the rich, but they refused. The system was gridlocked. And then came 1789. The French Revolution didn't start because of one event. It started because of decades of accumulated grievances, bad decisions, and corruption. It started because John Law had shown the people that their leaders were fallible. It started because Louis XV had shown them that kings could be selfish and incompetent. When the Bastille fell on July 14, 1789, it wasn't just a prison being stormed. It was the final collapse of a system that had been dying since 1720. Louis XVI would lose his head to the guillotine in 1793, a direct consequence of sins committed long before he was born.
The story of John Law and the Mississippi Bubble is often remembered as a footnote in economic history, a curious tale of a financial experiment gone wrong. But its impact was far more profound than that. It was a catalyst, a turning point, the moment when the illusion of absolute monarchy began to crack. What made Law's scheme so dangerous wasn't just that it failed. It was that it revealed a fundamental truth. Authority figures don't always know what they're doing. Kings can be fooled. Systems can be manipulated. And when those in power prioritize their own interests over the common good, disaster follows. The Mississippi Bubble taught the French people to question everything. Before Law, the monarchy had been seen as divinely ordained, infallible, eternal. After Law, it was just another institution run by flawed, greedy men. Louis XV's reign only reinforced that lesson. His indifference, his extravagance, his refusal to address the kingdom's problems, all of it confirmed what people had already started to suspect. The monarchy didn't care about them. By the time Louis XVI came to power, it was already too late. The damage had been done. The social contract between rulers and ruled had been broken. And when the revolution finally came, it came with a fury that had been building for 70 years. Historians often debate what caused the French Revolution. Was it Enlightenment philosophy, economic inequality, bad harvests? The answer is all of the above. But the roots go deeper. Back to that moment in 1720, when a Scottish gambler convinced a desperate regent that you could create wealth out of thin air. John Law's experiment failed spectacularly, but the idea behind it didn't die. Throughout history, governments have returned to the same temptation: printing money, inflating currency, creating illusions of prosperity. Sometimes it works, for a while. But eventually, reality catches up. It always does. The Mississippi Bubble was one of the first modern financial crises, but it certainly wasn't the last. The South Sea Bubble in England happened at almost the same time. The Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis. Each one followed a similar pattern: excessive speculation, irrational exuberance, and the mistaken belief that the rules of economics don't apply anymore. Law himself died in obscurity, but his ghost haunts every financial bubble. Every time a market soars beyond reason, every time people believe that this time is different, they're repeating his mistake. And yet, there's something almost tragic about Law's story. He wasn't entirely a villain. He genuinely believed his system could work. He thought he was saving France, not destroying it. His crime wasn't malice. It was hubris. He thought he was smarter than history, cleverer than human nature. He was wrong. The French monarchy never recovered. Louis XVI tried to reform, but the forces unleashed by decades of corruption and incompetence were too powerful. The revolution consumed him, consumed the nobility, consumed the old order entirely. From the ashes rose something new, a republic. Imperfect, violent, chaotic, but built on the idea that power comes from the people, not from God or kings. It was a radical shift, and it changed the world. The irony is that John Law, the man who helped destroy the French monarchy, believed in progress. He believed in modernity. He believed that new ideas could solve old problems. In a way, he was right. His failure helped pave the way for the democratic revolutions that followed. So, what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this. Systems built on illusion can't last. Whether it's a financial system built on imaginary wealth or a political system built on the divine right of kings, eventually reality asserts itself. You can't print your way to prosperity. You can't ignore your people suffering forever. And when the reckoning comes, it comes hard. John Law thought he could outsmart the system. Louis XV thought he could outlast the problems. They were both wrong. And the price of their mistakes was paid in blood, revolution, and the end of an era. This is the story of how one man's ambition and one king's indifference set the stage for one of history's most dramatic revolutions. It's a reminder that decisions have consequences, that greed and corruption eventually catch up with you, and when systems fail the people they're supposed to serve, those people will eventually tear them down and build something new. If this story made you think, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. What modern-day bubbles do you think we're living in right now? Let's discuss. And remember, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. See you in the next one.